Euphoria didn't end badly because it ran out of ideas. It ended badly because it forgot what it actually was. 7 years. 3 seasons. And when the final credits rolled, a huge portion of the audience sat there feeling something they never expected to feel after watching Euphoria. Nothing. Not devastated, not satisfied, not even properly emotional. Just kind of empty. And I think that's actually the worst possible reaction a finale can get, because at least if people were angry, it would mean the show still had a grip on them. Anger means investment. Emptiness means disconnection. And that disconnection is exactly what the finale of Euphoria produced for a lot of people who had followed this show from the very beginning. Now, before I get into everything, I want to be upfront about something. This isn't a video where I just sit here and tell you that Euphoria's ending was a disaster, because it genuinely wasn't a disaster in the traditional sense. It wasn't poorly made television. The cinematography was still gorgeous, the performances were still strong, and there were individual moments in that finale that were genuinely beautiful and emotionally resonant. I'll get to those later on. But here's the thing, a finale isn't just another episode. A finale is a conversation between the show and its audience. It's the moment where everything that was built, every character you invested in, every storyline you followed, every emotional gut punch you sat through, it all has to mean something. It all has to land. And that is precisely where Euphoria's ending fell apart. What makes this even more interesting to me is the way the finale was actually positioned. It wasn't marketed as a series finale. It was framed as a season finale, which I actually think was a deliberate decision. And honestly, I get it. Look at what happened to Stranger Things. Look at what happened to The Boys. Both of those shows had their endings plastered everywhere, and everyone had their expectations dialed up to the absolute maximum. And both of them inevitably fell short because no ending can survive that level of anticipation. So maybe the people behind Euphoria looked at that and thought, right, let's just slip this out quietly and avoid all of that noise. And in fairness, that strategy probably did soften the blow a little bit. Because if this had been marketed as the grand, definitive ending to one of the most talked about shows of the last decade, the reaction would have been significantly worse. But here's where that strategy also becomes a bit of a problem. Because by not committing to it being a finale, it almost felt like the show itself wasn't fully committed to giving us a proper ending. And you could feel that in the episode. There was no real sense of weight to it. No sense that this was the last time we'd ever be in this world with these characters. It just felt like another episode that happened to be the last one. And for a show like Euphoria, which built its entire identity on being visually and emotionally overwhelming, on making you feel things so deeply that you almost couldn't breathe, settling for something that just felt like another episode is a real failure. Because think about what Euphoria was at its best. Season 1 of this show was genuinely unlike anything else on television. The way it handled addiction, trauma, identity, and the brutal chaos of being young. It did all of that in a way that was raw and honest and completely unflinching. It wasn't trying to be comfortable. It wasn't trying to make you feel okay about what you were watching. It grabbed you and it didn't let go. And the characters were a massive part of that. Rue, Jules, Maddie, Cassie, Lexi, Nate. These weren't just characters. They were people that audiences genuinely felt connected to. People sat with these characters through some incredibly dark and painful moments, and that kind of connection doesn't just happen automatically. It's built over time, episode by episode, scene by scene. And when you build that kind of connection with an audience, you owe them something at the end. You owe them a proper goodbye. And the finale just didn't deliver that. Instead, what we got was an episode that spent the majority of its runtime following a character that had barely featured throughout the entire final season. And I want to be really clear here. I'm not saying the character was bad, and I'm absolutely not saying the performance was anything other than exceptional. But when I pressed play on the finale of a show that I'd been watching for years, following characters that I'd become genuinely attached to, I expected to spend that time with them. I expected Rue to be at the center of it. I expected Maddie and Cassie to have real weight in it. I expected Jules to matter in a way that she barely did across the whole of Season 3. And what I got instead was something that felt more like a self-contained Western thriller than the closing chapter of one of the most emotionally intense shows in recent television history. That's not a small issue. That's a fundamental problem with how the finale was structured, and it's the thing I want to break down properly throughout this video. Let's talk about the actual structural problem at the heart of this finale, because I think once you see it clearly, you can unsee it. The final episode of Euphoria essentially sidelined the core cast, the characters that the entire show was built around, in favor of spending the bulk of its runtime on a storyline that felt disconnected from everything that made this show what it was. And I don't use the word sidelined lightly, because that's genuinely what happened. Rue, Maddie, Cassie, Lexi, Jules, all of them were pushed to the edges of their own finale. And for a show that spent years making you care deeply about every single one of those people, that is a real problem that goes beyond just a structural complaint. Now, I do want to acknowledge that there was closure given to the characters. I'm not going to sit here and pretend the finale completely ignored them, because it didn't. Cassie essentially came to terms with the fact that she once chose money and status over genuine connection, and now she was left to mourn Nate completely alone with no one beside her. Maddie got that sense of release and freedom after Alamo's death, like a weight had finally been lifted off her. Jules ended up stuck in this dark, hollow version of the life she had chosen, devoid of real love, devoid of passion, just existing for money. Lexi had her own quiet realization that she needed to stop overthinking everything and start being more present and empathetic with the people around her. And Rue, in the saddest and most painful way possible, could only find peace in death because this world had simply become too much for her to carry. Those are all meaningful conclusions for those characters. I'm not dismissing any of that. But here's my issue with all of it. The way those conclusions were delivered felt rushed, surface level, and almost like the show was just ticking boxes rather than truly honoring the journeys those characters had been on. We didn't get real, meaningful interactions between these people in their final moments together. We didn't get the weight of Rue's death properly felt by the people who loved her. Think about that for a second. Rue, the character who is quite literally the heartbeat of this entire show, the person whose addiction, whose pain, whose fight to survive had been the emotional core of Euphoria from the very first episode, died, and it barely registered for most of the characters around her. Jules reacted, but beyond that, it was almost like the others had already moved on before she was even gone. There was no devastation. There were no real conversations. There was no sense that losing Rue was this enormous, earth-shattering moment for the people who had spent years in her orbit. And I think that speaks to a much bigger problem with how the finale was paced. Rue's death came far too early in the episode. If you're going to kill off your main character, the person the show has followed from day one, that needs to be a moment that the entire episode builds towards. It needs to breathe. It needs space around it so that the audience can actually sit in the grief of it. Instead, it happened, and then the episode just kept moving like it had other things to get to. Which, as it turned out, it did, because the back half of the finale was essentially given over to Ollie and the Western shootout storyline. And look, I'll be honest, Ollie's presence in the finale wasn't the problem in itself. Coleman Domingo's performance was genuinely one of the best things about the entire season, and the monologue he delivered about addiction